Hello everyone, and welcome to this Kerbal Space Program orbit tutorial. Now what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to show you how to build a rocket from scratch in Kerbal Space Program version 0.21 and launch it so that it can get into orbit and then optionally also get out of orbit and safely land an astronaut back on the planet. Now this is in no way going to be the perfect way to do so. It is not going to even be a great way. It's just simply a way that I have known that works, that hopefully can introduce you to some concepts to the game that'll help you sort of get a grasp on the basics of the game. I actually made a video back in 0.18 of the game, but it seems a lot of the parts used have changed, and so have the game mechanics that make it no longer relevant. So here's our shipbuilding area. We're going to use the command pod Mark 1. It'll hold one astronaut. It is a tiny little pod, and it'll do the job for what we need to do. So first things first, I'm going to lift it all the way up here so we got plenty of space to work with underneath. And we're going to make this very simple. So like I said, optionally we want this thing to land safely. So the first thing we're going to need is a parachute. So over here in the utilities tab, you have the Mark 16 parachute. We're going to plop it right on top. And this is all we want to land. So what that means is we're going to need to separate the rest of the ship from this section for when it comes time to landing. So we're going to take this piece right here, the stacked coupler, and we're going to put it underneath. And as you can see here, what that does is create separate stages. So when I'm hitting space in our launch, it's going to go through our stages from the bottom to the top. And that's how we're going to advance through our stages. So as you can see, the last stage here is that the parachute's going to open, and the one before it is going to separate whatever's here. So now what we need to do is we need to have a stage that we're going to dedicate towards getting the ship to fall back to the planet. Now it's sort of interesting, when you're designing a ship in this game, you sort of need to think backwards. You need to think about what you're going to be doing last and then move all the way frontwards until you get to your launch stage. So we have this little tank of gas. Now first what I'm going to do, and you don't have to do this for your ship, but I'm going to do it, is I'm going to add an advanced stabilizer, which is going to help the ship stay steady when I'm flying it. So we've got that. Then underneath it, we've got a little pot of fuel here. Let me show you where I grabbed that. That was in propulsion. On the second page here, you have this tiny little fuel tank. We only need a little bit, because at that point we'll be in orbit, and we just need to close out the orbit. We need to destroy the orbit. And for that, we just need a tiny little rocket. So I'm going to grab this one here, the liquid fuel engine. Now the reason we don't need a large engine is because we're going to be in orbit, we're going to be above the atmosphere, so there's going to be no air resistance. So it's going to be relatively easy to sort of kill the orbit that we've got set up. So this will be in space, and this is what we're going to use to get back home. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to take another one of those stacked couplers, and we're going to put it underneath, and it automatically adds that little cover there. And we're going to set up the stages that are going to get us into space. So for that, we're going to be using these fuel tanks, the T800s. They're essentially 4 of those smaller ones stacked automatically. And we're going to go ahead and let's put 3 for good measure. Now this is sort of this is where I fall back on not being the perfect way, because there is a science to how much fuel and how much mass you have, and that all does matter. But I'm sort of eyeballing it here because for me the game is fun when it's sort of just off the cuff. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take this liquid fuel engine, the T30, and I'm going to pop it underneath it. So we have this rocket, and as you can see we have it staged, so it'll fire this rocket, and then I'll stage up, and it will disconnect and fire the next rocket, and then break off, and we'll do the parachute. So this alone will probably not get you into orbit. It probably won't even get you into space. What we're going to do now is something called Asparagus Staging. Now I'm not sure why it's called asparagus. There's also something called onion staging, which makes a little bit more sense. And the idea is we're going to add layers to this ship, and we're going to do so in a way that allows us to shed the layers as we're going up so that the ship stays as light as possible. And for that, what we're going to need are radial decouplers. So like the stacked decouplers, they separate the two pieces of the ship, but in a different way, off the sides. And what I did was I clicked the symmetry mode here and I set it to 2. And I also set the angle to angle snap so that we could sort of pick a precise angle. And I'm going to do 2, but I'm going to do it twice so that we have 4. So we've got 2 there, and then we're going to do 2 again, and we're going to put them right there. So we've got 4. We have 2 sets of decouplers, 4 decouplers in total. Now, the way it's set now, they're both going to disconnect at the same time. That's not how we want to do that. What we want is we want this set here to disconnect first. Now, you notice when I mouse over it, the box under stage 5 highlights so that I know which ones that I'm selecting, and I'm going to drag them over to this stage. So now these two will separate before these two separate, and that's exactly what we want for asparagus staging. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add, and now this is the part where overkill comes in, I'm going to add these big tanks here, these X232 fuel tanks. Why not? And I'm going to still have it on the symmetry for the 2X symmetry. We're going to attach them. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to attach another set. And I don't think we need to attach a third set. We'll stay with 2. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to do that here again on the same side. Now we're sort of eyeballing it. They're not going to line up perfectly. For a small ship like this, that's okay. If the ship is imbalanced, it will sort of affect how it flies. But I think something like this, so minor, it shouldn't be a big deal. So now underneath all of these, we're going to have to add rockets. We're going to add these big skipper fuel engines. Or no, I'm sorry. We're going to be adding these mainsail liquid engines. And so we're going to set our first set here. And we're going to set our second set here. So now we've got 4 big rockets, engines, and then this one small engine. And it's all connected. But here we go again. When we hit space, it's going to launch all 4 and also disconnect 2. So we need to separate these 2. Now here's where the genius of asparagus staging comes in. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to grab this rocket, our 4th stage rocket, and I'm going to drag it down to the 6th stage. So now when I launch the rocket, all of these are going to go off at once. And that doesn't seem like it makes a whole lot of sense, because it doesn't as it is. But here's the key to asparagus staging. It all is in this part here under propulsion, the fuel duct. So the way we have it set up, these tanks are going to drop out first. So what I'm going to do is, we still have it set to 2 symmetry. I'm going to click on the tank, make sure it's the big tank first, and then I'm going to click on over to these tanks, right? And then once I have that set up, I'm going to click on these tanks, and I'm going to click it over to this tank. So what does that do? What that does is that feeds fuel from one tank to another. So what that means is, when I hit launch, all of the fuel being used in all 5 of these rockets are going to be coming from these 2 tanks, which guarantees that these 2 tanks are going to be the first 2 to empty. So when I hit that stage and these 2 tanks drop off, they're going to be the empty tanks. And then these 2 will be completely full, and it'll go through these 2. And then again, I'm going to stage through, and then they're going to fall off. And then when all 4 of these external tanks fall off, we will have just this rocket left in the middle, and it will be completely full of fuel, and it'll be good to continue its travel. So what we're going to also add, just for added stability, are winglets. We're going to add 2 on these tanks, and we're going to add 2 on these tanks. And then, finally, the last thing we're going to put on, we're going to put struts. Struts basically just add support. See, if we were to launch this, because it's connected up here and not down here, the bottoms would probably wobble a lot. So we're going to add struts to that. We're going to add struts to that. We can even add struts if we want some stability up here. We can add some struts up here going down here. And we can add some struts up here going down here. So this ship should do the job. I'm going to add one more thing to make life easier for us. And it's actually going to be all the way up here. See, this is the staging you sort of want it. You want it to look like this. Now I'm going to add one last thing. Like I said, I'm going to pull this off. We're going to go to propulsion. We're going to look for this R10 RCS fuel tank. We're going to add it. Oh, that's the tiny one. Never mind. We want the R25. I'm sorry. And we're going to add it, and then we're going to just drag this back on. And then what we're going to add is under control, you're going to look for these Rcs Thrusters. Maybe we'll get 3, and we'll pop them right on here. RCS fuel is just small monopropellant fuel, and that'll help us in space, because in space, when you have no air, wings and all of those sorts of pieces that you can use to change the direction of ship don't have the same effect because there's no air around it to sort of affect the motion of the rocket. So these little thrusters will help. And as you can see, they don't really show up here on the staging because they're just constantly on until they run out of fuel. So this is what you want your ship to look like. And this is what the staging is going to look like. And when that's all set, you just hit launch here, and we're going to launch the rocket. Okay, so here we are on our launch pad. I'm going to do a couple of things first. First things first, I'm going to hit the T key, which enables SAS, which is going to help us stay steady as we go up. I'm also going to throttle us up, maybe about 2/3 of the way, and then I'm going to hit space to launch. Now here's the trick. You want to conserve your fuel within the first 12,000 meters or so, because you're really fighting a lot of the gravity of the planet. So there are two things you want to keep in mind. So for the first 12,000 meters, you want to try and keep the speed of your ship down here under 200 meters a second. And you want to just keep going straight up until about 12,000 meters. So as you can see, the speed's going up and up, but it's going up a little too fast. So I'm going to throttle down a little bit. I just want to make sure that it's always going up, but it just doesn't go over 200. And we're going to keep an eye on our altitude here, and we can worry a little less about this until when we get to 12,000 meters. So as you can see, the fuel is emptying in a uneven rate because our outer fuel tanks are launching at sort of emptying at a different rate. And we're going to see the two outer ones actually empty soon. And when we do, we're going to hit the space key, and it's going to shed them. And now, as you can see, these 3 fill back up again because now we're going on the full fuel tanks. Now we're at about 9,000 meters here and 183 meters a second. So we're actually doing pretty good. We could throttle up a little bit. We're going to hit 210,000. It's not an exact science. Now at this point, we're going to turn off our SAS. Or actually, with the new 2.1, 0.21, we don't have to. You're going to tilt it to the right so that it's at 90 degrees. And I usually stop on the number 90, for now at least. And we're just going to leave it like that. And because when you're in orbit, what's important is your delta velocity, which is your sideways speed. Because the idea of orbit in general is that you're flying horizontally so fast that as you fall towards the Earth curves underneath you so you never hit the ground. When you get to the point where you will never hit the ground, that's when you've reached orbital velocity, and that's what we're trying to do. Right now we're at about 500 meters a second. We could kick up the throttle a bit. As you can see, this indicates where we are in the atmosphere. Things are going to get very easy for us once we're out of the atmosphere. Now I'm going to hit M to bring up the map, and it's going to show us our path. The apoapsis is the highest point in your orbit. Right now it's 70,000 meters. The number that I usually look for is around 80 to 90. At that point, you're above the atmosphere. So here we are, 110. We're going to hit X to stop our engines. And so at this point, just purely off of the rockets we have, we're coasting to this point. Now, we're going to add a node. So notice when I mouse over this little orb pops up. If you left click, you could add a maneuver. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the prograde, which is this green little circle, and we're going to click and drag, and that's going to create a plot for a maneuver. And we just want to keep dragging this until you see that little PE symbol appear. Now, if I let go, our AP is 160 and our PE is 109. Both of them are safely above the atmosphere, so we don't have to worry about atmospheric drag. So we're going to let go. Now you'll see a new little icon here on your nav ball. That is where we want to point the ship in order to hit that maneuver. So we're going to use our WSAD key to get over there. And down here, node in T means how long we have until we have to hit our our engines, and estimated burn will tell us how long we have to hit our engines for in order to get that plot that we have planned out. So we're going to go ahead and maneuver over to it. Now, we have a minute and a half until we have to hit our engines. I'm going to speed up time so we get there a little faster. The music is a good indicator that you're above the atmosphere and you're in space at this point. Alright, we're at 8 seconds. So at 8 seconds, I'm just going to hit the rockets full throttle. 2, 1, full throttle. And as you can see, this green bar starts to lower. And when this bar gets all the way to the bottom, theoretically, you are at the point you want to be. So we're going to keep doing that. Now, as you can see, those tanks have emptied, so I'm going to hit space so we drop them. But look, now we have this whole thing is full of fuel. But because we don't have as much thrust with the 3 engines, this has slowed down a little bit. But at this point, that doesn't matter. We're safely going to get into orbit. And usually when the camera changes like that, it means we are in orbit. So I'm going to kill our engines right now. And if I check my map, I could delete this little plan. And sure enough, PE is 116, AP 145. We're in orbit. I could now speed things up, and we will orbit the planet forever. As fast as it'll let me go. So now we're in orbit. So if you followed everything up to the, down to the mark, at this point, you should be in orbit. Now here comes the optional part. Let's get out of orbit. Since we have a lot of fuel, it should be no problem. However, let's say you use more fuel than usual. In fact, let's just break out of that stage. So we've only got this little bit here. What you want to do to get out of orbit is you need to slow down, because that's essentially all orbit is going so fast that you never hit the planet as you're falling. So if you slow down, you will hit the planet. So what you need to do is go into a retrograde position. Now, retrograde, you can tell, is this little green circle with an X through it. Prograde would be on the other side, and it has no X through it, and that would extend our orbit, but we want to reduce it. So we're going to go on this X here, and we're going to throttle up, and when I hit space, it'll fire the engines. And as you can see now, it's going to start shrinking, and it'll keep shrinking. And before you know it, that PE disappears, which means we are no longer in orbit. And the path, as you can see, as we follow that path, we're going to hit the ocean, and then we're going to hit the ground, and I'm going to keep firing until we hit the land again. So we can have a nice terrestrial landing. Great. So we're good at this point. Even though we still have plenty of fuel, we're good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate the stage again. So I'm going to hit space. So now we're just a pod. And all we have to do is let time and gravity do the rest. So I'm going to speed up time a little bit. As you can see, our altitude is dropping. It'll eventually force you to slow down once you hit the atmosphere. Jeb's having a fun time of this. We're going to speed up again. Because as we're right now, we're still technically outside of the atmosphere until we hit this little mark there. Or I should say the atmosphere is so thin, it doesn't really matter at this point. Once we get to this point, it's going to matter. And what you'll see is interesting is you'll see the effect of air resistance. Right now, we're going 2,000 meters a second. And there is nothing slowing us down right now but oxygen. The air in the atmosphere is all that's going to slow us down. And you'll see we're speeding up here, but once we hit this blue area, this light blue, these two light blue areas, you're going to see our speed drastically reduce. And it just goes to show you, that's why orbit has to be done at such a high altitude, because if you try to orbit at a low altitude, the air will slow you down, and before you know it, you won't be able to maintain an orbital velocity. And now, we're in the atmosphere because we're getting that atmospheric burn. In real life, this is when asteroids would break up or explode, just like the one in Russia recently. And there's our speed dropping. See, now we're at 15. When we hit this light blue section here, I'm going to hit space again to trigger the parachutes. Of course, I could do it a little early. It doesn't matter. Right now, the heat doesn't damage parachutes. Who knows if they add that later. And as you can see, that'll slow us down even more dramatically. And really, I mean, at this point, if we were to hit the ground at 400 meters a second, we would still turn Jeb into a smear on the planet's surface. But we will only get slower at this point. I'm going to speed things up again. Now, see, it'll warn you if you speed things up too much. It messes with the physics a little. So I'm just going to stay at 2x. Our speed is continuing to drop, 170 and dropping. $130. At this point, we have the parachute helping us, but again, the atmosphere is doing a great amount to slow us down. Now I'm going to return us to a normal speed here. Don't panic, because it is going to take a while before the parachute expands like it just did. See, we're pretty close to the ground compared, you know, relatively speaking. So it almost looks like the parachute wasn't going to expand, but it did. And then we're going to safely land here in the desert, which we could just pretend is another planet. Certain things to keep in mind. When you take off, it's at sea level, so 0 meters is the ground, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's everywhere. We could be in an area with heightened terrain. So, for instance, usually the parachute opens around 400 meters, but here it opened around 600 or 700, which tells us that we're above sea level, and we're going to probably land above sea level. This doesn't matter so much for a parachute landing like this because you're just letting gravity do its part. But if you were to do a more complicated landing, like a powered landing on the moon or any sort of planet that doesn't have an atmosphere where you can't use a parachute, you need to keep that in mind because you need to make sure you're going at a slow enough speed. At this point, we're going 6 meters a second. This is safe. It'll be a little rough for Jeb, but it's enough that the ship won't break or explode. But you always want to make sure that you're going the right speed at the right altitude so that you land safely. And there you have it. We can now pop him out. And here he was. Jeb was the first person to go into orbit the planet, and land safely. Hopefully this was helpful for you. Like I said, it isn't the most ideal way. We did have a lot of excess fuel, so I probably overdid a little bit on the rockets. You sort of need to just play around and see what the right ratio is, because remember, for every fuel tank you add, you're also adding more mass, which means it's going to take more to get into orbit. So it is a delicate balance that you need to sort of play with. But for something this simple, you can kind of go overkill. You'll see it is much harder when you're trying to send somebody to Joule and back. In any case, I hope this was helpful. I hope this helped you in your first steps in enjoying Kerbal Space Program. It is a very complex and in-depth game, easy to play, hard to master. I hope you enjoy every moment of it. I hope you have a fantastic time with the game, and I hope to see you in future videos of Kerbal Space Program. Bye, everyone.